Welcome to the 8th module in the Civilis Arabica program. We're now actually transitioning away from the ancient Arabian landscape. We have looked at the northern, the southern, and the regional kingdoms, but also the civilizations that are dotted around ancient Arabia. We've also looked at their lifestyle, the culture, the religious background, the economy of the people who used to live in these regions in ancient times. We are now moving closer towards the epicenter of where the story begins when it comes to Islamic history, and this is in Mecca. Now, we have looked at in the previous session the previous dynasties that ruled over Mecca, beginning with the very short reign of Ismail alayhi salam and his children 𝗏𝗏 and 𝗾𝙀𝗦, followed by the very lengthy reign of Banu Quraish, the Ghuramites. We then looked at the actual reign of the 𝗾𝙗𝗎𝗏 dynasty. We are now going to look into the advent of the Qurayshid dynasty. And this is really where we look at the ancestry of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and we truly begin to hone into really the beginning phase of the advent of Islam in Arabia in the 7th century. So this session today will be focused especially and specifically on the kingdom and dynasty of Quraysh, King Qusay ibn Kilab. This is you could say, the progenitor of the Quraysh really in Mecca and their reign to power. So we will be looking at various very interesting themes and topics in this unit, beginning with, first and foremost, Quraysh. There were two Quraysh in the history of Banu Quraish. The first one being Fihr ibn Malik, and he is the ancestor of all Quraysh. Right? He goes back several centuries. And he's somebody who basically his name is lent later on to the second Quraysh, who establishes the Qurayshid dynasty in Mecca. So we're going to look at the ancient history of the ancestry of Quraysh, but also who these people were and who this man was. We work our way down. Now, Qusay ibn Kilab, or Zayd ibn Kilab, is the person who establishes the Qurayshid dynasty. And so we're going to begin with his life story from infancy onwards and how he went about gaining power. He was actually the man who overthrew the 𝗾𝙗𝗎𝗏 dynasty in Mecca. And so he's a very, very important figure. And in fact, he's a tremendous, extraordinary figure in the history of the Arabs in general, but in particular, Quraysh, Mecca, and the advent of Islam. He establishes institutions in Mecca, within the Kaaba itself and surrounding the Kaaba, that until today are being maintained by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and was actually found and preserved by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he's a very, very consequential figure in the history of Islam. And he's, of course, an illustrious ancestor of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we're going to look into the life of Zayd ibn Kilab and also his accomplishments. Amazing human being. Now, Qusay had sons. And of course, any major emperor or any major dynastic founder, when they die, they leave behind a tremendous inheritance. And so he had sons, and these sons were inheritors to his, you could say, dynasty in Mecca. However, in a very short space of time, the family of Qusay fell apart, and there was a rift within the family due to competition as to who should gain power in Mecca, who's more deserving, who's less deserving. And this creates a rift amongst Quraysh that continues. The enmity between these families continues up until the advent of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who eventually reconciles Quraysh and brings them back together. Okay, so we will look at the family rift because it has an impact on the seerah. When you look at the companions who initially opposed Banu Hashim or opposed Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, there's a historical context to that. Okay, and there's a reason why certain companions opposed Islam until the very last moments. And we get to understand that by looking at the initial rift, the inheritance rift, when King Qusay, because he was a king, when he dies. We then look at the confederacy of Mecca. So again, this is a tribal region. These are tribal people. And tribal identity supersedes personal identity. And so again, in order for us to really appreciate and really, really understand the dynamics at play when we look at the seerah, especially in Mecca, we need to understand the different tribes who are operating in Mecca and where they were siding when it came to the civil war that eventually erupts in Mecca. These tribes and tribal affiliations reveal a lot when we look at the seerah, the companions who joined Islam early, who left until the last moment. Even after Islam, the different ongoing feuds, it never ended with Islam. It continued even after Islam. We want the background context to that, okay? But to keep in mind, all of these are actually descendants of Qusay ibn Kilab or his associates in Mecca. So we're going to look at that. Very important, very interesting. And as I mentioned, I alluded to earlier on, Qusay ibn Kilab, he overthrows the existing dynasty in Mecca. He overthrows Banu Khuza'ah. However, he does so in a very ingenious and very fascinating way. A combination of diplomacy, but also war strategy. He's a very, very shrewd politician and a very, very clever and intelligent individual. And so we're going to understand and study how he went about overthrowing the government in Mecca and establishing his own dynasty. Okay. Now keep in mind, when we talk of the ancestry of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in any classical book of Sirah, the first chapter deals with the ancestry of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. However, unfortunately, in many of these classical texts, it's almost a very short synopsis of names. It's nothing more than just names. It gives you the names and it goes all the way down to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. We want to unravel that. We want these names to have character. We want these names to have a meaning. We want to know the people behind the names, their life story. Who were they? What did they leave behind? And why is it that even after becoming the Prophet of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and conquering Mecca, Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam will still talk highly of his ancestors? Okay, these ancestors we mentioned today, we're going to go through. So it's very, very interesting actually, as we cross over from ancient Arabia and the generic side of ancient Arabia to a more specific regional focused attention on the house of Banu Quraish. We need to understand who these people are. And again, as I said before, many Sirah books and even courses, they begin with a very short genealogy, sometimes just the names, and then they move on. And if you're very generous, they may tell you about Fihr ibn Malik and Qusay ibn Kilab, and then they jump to Abdullah ibn Abdul Muttalib, and they go on from there. We want to analyze each name properly and understand and appreciate who they were and what they were when it comes to the regional politics and also the cultural heritage, because Quraysh are not inconsequential. If in the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala there is an entire chapter, an entire surah named Surah al-Quraysh, then it certainly means that these people are not inconsequential. They're not inconsequential. So we need to know why were they so consequential that there's even an entire surah in the Quran named Quraysh. Okay, and we're going to learn all of that today, inshallah. And also the rise. So once they establish and Qusay ibn Kilab becomes a king of Mecca, he was a king. In At-Tabari ibn Kathir, he's described as Malik in the Qawmi. He was a king amongst his people. And I know for some people who have read the hadith or the incident where Abu Sufyan meets the Byzantine emperor, the Byzantine governor in Damascus, who questions him about Muhammad and his ancestry. Again, it's very important here, his ancestry. Does he have any kings in his ancestry? And Abu Sufyan says no. We will answer that conundrum here, because he indeed had a king in his ancestry. And we covered this in the Banu Umayyah series anyway, but for a refresher, we'll have it again here today, inshallah. Now, Darun Nadwa. Darun Nadwa, you know, the house of consultation, is a fascinating establishment. Again, we want to dispel the myth of Arab inferiority, that the Arabs had no civilization before Islam, that the Arabs had no form of government or no form of civility. Darun Nadwa is a fascinating prototype for how to govern a city, and we're going to understand the genius of Qusay ibn Kilab, because not only did he change the physical landscape of Mecca, he changed it physically. He organized in such a way that really it leaves you wondering, but also the administrative side of how he ruled over Mecca. Very thorough, very systematic, and as I said before, some of the institutions he established were maintained even after Islam. And in fact, the Quran reveals ayat to maintain those institutions. And to this very day, the Saudi establishment maintains those institutions. And it goes back to who? Qusay ibn Kilab. So we're going to understand Darun Nadwa. What does it mean, Darun Nadwa? What did it stand for? What were the different ministries in Mecca? Mecca had ministries. And how did they function? What was the purpose behind the ministries? Who did what? How did we decide who did what, right? Fascinating stuff. Fascinating stuff. We will conclude then by looking at the rift, again, going back to the rift and the issue of the families falling apart following his death. Because after every great man, typically there's a rumble or there's a rush towards who's going to inherit what he left behind. Unfortunately, when Qusay dies, everything he had worked for and everything he had built in Mecca is divided, and his sons are divided, and the society is divided. Even the leadership is divided, up until the advent of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who unites them once again under Islam. Okay. And finally, we will have a quick overview of some of the clans and tribes who are again allied with one side against the other. And the importance of understanding this is that as we read the seerah, we come across names and figures who come from tribes that were actively involved in either opposing or supporting the tribes of Quraysh. Right? So it's a fascinating overview. And again, from this moment onwards, this program will be focused specifically on the household of Banu Quraish. And with each subsequent unit, we get closer and closer to the household of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in great detail. Again, we want to enter this phase of our studies with tremendous insight, meaningful analysis, not just names, but meaningful analysis, so that when we come to actually looking at the life of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he is born, we have so much background information on this person. We know so much about his ancestry. We know so much about his society and the city he's born in, because again, Mecca is mentioned as al-Qura, the mother of cities. Again, you need to understand the history of the city. Why are these things being mentioned in the Quran if they are inconsequential? Who are Quraysh really? Why is Mecca so important that is mentioned as the mother of cities in terms of not just the holy place it holds in Islam, but in a general sense? It was quite an astonishing city, how it was organized again before Islam and was maintained even after Islam. Now, I find tremendous value in understanding the transition between pre-Islamic Mecca to post-Islamic Mecca, because Islam as a force of civilization, but a force also a culture and a system, does not always come to erase everything so that it can rebuild everything. This is a misconception that some modern Muslims have, that Islam comes to erase everything, erase an entire structure and system so it can build a new one in its place. This is not the methodology of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we will see again, how does he repurpose what he found already in Mecca? When he conquers Mecca, how does he refurbish and repurpose these things? He does not destroy things to rebuild them again. And there are various examples of this we have already covered in the past sessions. For example, when he says to Aisha radiallahu anha, this building, the Kaaba that you are seeing, is not currently in the right dimensions. It's not the original dimensions that Ibrahim left it in. I wish I were able to rebuild upon the initial dimensions, which was actually a rectangular form. But he kept it the way it was because of social dynamics. There is so much wisdom here for some of us who live in the West or outside the Muslim world, or even within the Muslim world. System change and reformation. What are the procedures? Do you remove everything? Are there things you can keep and maintain and repurpose and refurbish? There's a lot of wisdom here. And the Prophet ﷺ, being the wisest and the most successful human being to ever grace this earth, demonstrates this when he enters Mecca. And he maintains pretty much everything, except the few things that were no longer necessary or no longer acceptable in a society that was now under Islam. But the structure and the system, the order of things in Mecca remained pretty much the same, except he had repurposed and refurbished. Again, for those of us who are activists, people who are ideologues who want to change the world, take note of this. Your task is not to change everything, to remove everything, to destroy everything, to rebuild again. You are to actually work with what's available and to improve. As Ibn Taymiyyah says, Islam is not a hammer, Islam is a polish. Islam is not a hammer, Islam is a polish. We polish what we can. We're not here to destroy, to rebuild. We're here to polish and to improve and to repurpose. So by studying this, the system and structure of Mecca before Islam, I hope by the end of this session, inshallah, you will appreciate, right, the administrative skill and genius of Qusay, but also that is inherited later on by his descendants, Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam.
If you're enjoying this lecture and would like to learn more about the history of ancient Arabia in all of her glory, then you will love Civilis Arabica. This series of lectures is delivered as part of an annual history program for only £10 a month. In it, you'll be able to uncover 2,000 years of pre-Islamic history through an immersive and unique learning experience delivered exclusively through the official Historion app. As a Patreon member, you may register onto this program by selecting the essential tier available on the membership page for instant access to over 7 complete and unique courses ranging from the history of the Umayyad Kingdom through to the rise and fall of the empires of Mali and Abyssinia. You will then be granted access to 7 complete and individual courses. Subscriptions may be cancelled at any time. There are no minimum terms or commitments.